South Africa as a whole has once again been shown up. Transparency International has given South Africa a score of 44 out of 100 in its Corruption Perception Index for this year. Scores are between 0 and 100, where 0 means highly corrupt, 100 means clean. NGO Corruption Watch said the fact that South Africa remains below 50 is a problem. Our score has hardly changed since 2012. Botswana is considered the most clean government in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's well ahead of us with a score of 63. Well, to discuss, we're now joined by Corruption Watch's Executive Director, David Lewis. Thank you for joining us, David. I have to ask you, just in light of that discussion with Becky Sibiya, so many scandals this year, claims of corporate governance, problems, insider trading, resignations at Hoskins. So just an opinion first before we look at the big picture. How are our companies behaving?
Well, you know, in the issues you mentioned, I mean, except I suppose where it refers to insider trading, but I don't know what you're referring to. Those are not corruption allegations. I mean, as far as to how our companies are doing on the corruption front, well, you know, in every case of grand corruption involving tenders, particularly, there's a private sector element and a public sector element, and so, you know, I think by definition, our companies are not, or companies operating in South Africa are not performing that well. Some are performing extremely well and are really concerned about corruption and really intent on tackling corruption. There's that wonderful story in the Star last night of the company that discovered, the board of directors that discovered it had received a tender without bidding. It didn't know this apparently, and it's asked the Gauteng government to take it back. Now that tells one something, I think, about the climate in South Africa at the moment.
That is leadership.
Yeah.
So let's look at our ranking by Transparency International, and it looks like we're a little less corrupt than last year, but you say that's cold comfort.
Yeah, you know, it's not insignificant. And we said this last year, when indeed we had also been relatively stable since the year before, is that maybe it offers a glimmer of a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, I would like to think that what it's a reflection of is the perception, and this perception would be accurate, that people are really fighting back against corruption. Nobody is lying down in South Africa and saying, well, this thing can be done about this. This is inevitable. And that includes leaders of government, it includes leaders of the private sector, and, you know, in our experience, above all, it includes ordinary people of South Africa and ordinary public servants. So that might be the reason why the perception is stabilizing, but it's disturbing because it's not a great score, and it's not a great position to be in. It is in territory that Transparency International deemed to be indicative of significant corruption. And, you know, what is even more concerning, and a good reason for not being smug, is that if you look what's below us, not so far below us, you're talking about different territory altogether, where corruption really can't be turned around. When you get into the sort of 90s and scores in the low 30s, they can't be turned around. When you think we have declined over about 6 or 7 years from the high 30s to the high 60s, we have to accept that there's always a possibility, unless we're really vigilant, that we can get into really, really bad territory.
And I mean, even in sub-Saharan Africa, we're not doing well. We're ninth. So we talk about South Africa as this leader with strong institutions, but they're not clean. And do you think there are investment implications there? Mauritius ahead of us, trying to position itself as a gateway to the
Absolutely.
continent.
Even if it were not for the comparison with Africa, there are investment implications. You know, this is a very authoritative index, and I have no doubt that investors consult it. I'm sure they consult a lot of other indices when they do their risk calculations of an investment, but I have no doubt that they consult it. I have no doubt that it filters through to tourists who are making a decision about whether to come and visit South Africa or not, and they see this perception index, they hear stories about, you know, traffic cops sitting outside ORT all the time and taking the first bribe as they enter the country. So I have no doubt that this impacts on foreign perceptions, although it's a reflection, the index is a reflection of local perceptions.
From what you were saying before, it sounds like we're at a crossroads. This has to be fixed, or we slide. And you say there are pockets of endemic corruption.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
There are, I'm afraid that the criminal justice authorities are a large problem. And of course, they're institutions that are there in significant part to combat corruption. And so it doesn't leave one feeling, terribly hopeful that the criminal justice departments are in such, criminal justice institutions are in such bad shape. There are other institutions where, you talk about corporate problems this year. I mean, let's not go to the state-owned enterprises for problems of governance, corruption, you name it. So yes, we have to be careful because there are pockets of endemic corruption. But luckily, we have some very good institutions. And there's some very good institutions at the crucial interface between the public and the private that I think are preventing us from sliding further, as is, as I say, popular outrage at corruption.
Finally, I think we're 67th, but we're looking at a long list of countries. Is that any comfort that there's a whole list of trailers behind us?
Of course, it tells us that we're far from the worst.
There's hope.
But it tells us also that we don't want to go there. Because you don't go from 67 to 90 and okay, so next year will be better. When you start to hit the 90s, you reach the situation where it is really difficult to turn around. You're in really bad company at that stage, and then you're in big trouble. You're in serious territory.
How do we start rooting it out?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reforms. I mean, there's the criminal justice authorities, and part of the problem of the criminal justice authorities is the impunity at the top. The impunity that seems to be accorded to politically connected people, not only politically connected people in the public sector or in government, but in the private sector as well. And in order for them to be immune from any investigation or prosecution, I'm afraid they have to keep the police, they have to keep the criminal justice authorities somewhat bent as well. So that's a big nexus of our problem, and reform needs to be introduced there. In the tender system, reform needs to be introduced, and these reforms are wholly feasible and will themselves go a long way towards addressing corruption. And there are other areas of partial reforms which could really make a big impact.
Well, hopefully we'll be having a more positive chat next year. Thank you very much for joining us. That was Corruption Watch's David Lewis. Some quick company news. Safika's chairman, Saki Makozoma, has stepped down as chair of insurance giant Liberty Holdings and as deputy chairman of Standard Bank. Makozoma says this is to develop opportunities available to Safika, which is in an expansion phase. Safika is in the minerals and resources sector.